just going to dive straight into it, and we can maybe finish a bit early if we've got a very small group, because it doesn't take quite as long when you've got commitment and involvement from a small group. Hi, Nabila, and welcome.
Good afternoon.
That's what happens when you drop into a meeting. People see your name appear.
Yeah.
Trying to think of ways of personalizing Teams meetings now that we're all so used to them, you know. And I've just come off the back of the Amy conference, which was a nightmare because Amy believes in running all weekend, and they actually ran 23-hour sessions because they were trying to get everybody all over the world. So the amount of screen time involved there, and just trying to keep your concentration from one thing to another certainly does take your energy and effort. Yes, thank you. Depends what you're hauling. Go ahead, share with us.
I'm always amused, but also I'm sure I do it too, that colleagues who purport to teach and offer experience about good teaching and good communication can do something as brutal as have a 23-hour weekend-long meeting. And I do applaud France with its insistence, which I don't think would ever work here, that people do not send or expect answers to emails that are after working hours, to protect family life and mental health.
That is a really interesting point. Specifically also because people develop expectations. So if your first two weekend emails were answered, then if you don't get answered on the weekend, then you think, what's wrong with that person? So yeah, maybe it's about institutional culture impacting on societal culture.
It's true, and I'm sure many of you might have had the experience. I once had a line manager who was an insomniac, I think, but she would send us emails at between 2 and 4 in the morning, and it raised our level of panic, and we all started behaving in that way, which caused lots of problems we had to sort out later.
Yeah, it is problematic, especially if you remember something in the middle of the night and you want to send the message because you want it out of your head, and yet the staff member thinks, oh my gosh, I've got to act on this right now. Yeah, I think, as you can see, communication needs to be made clear. You know, even if you are going to remember things in the middle of the night, then make sure your team understands that they don't have to respond until office hours the next day. Can't say how that would just add to their stress, though. Okay, welcome everybody. I suppose I should have opened with an opening slide, which would tell us where we're going and what we're doing today. The joy of, there we go. So we're doing a mini series within the series, which is every fourth week of this learning session slot, we consider developing your teaching portfolio. The idea right at the beginning of the year was that hopefully by the end of all of this, you will have a functional teaching portfolio as well as have learned a whack load about clinical teaching. So we'll still get feedback and comments about how that actually worked. Although it's interesting that we haven't had that many actual construction lessons on your teaching portfolio. So just to remind you quickly, for those who haven't been in the sessions, we first spoke in generic terms about why you need a teaching portfolio, and Prof. Cook and Yanis took us through some examples, like looking at the Vanderbilt site of why you need to have a teaching portfolio. Then we went on to a generic idea of how you would develop your own teaching philosophy and what that philosophy could look like. We then looked at ways that you could store your portfolio and present it. So from online sites like Portfolium to keeping everything in a Google Doc or in a SharePoint file, or however you want to do that. And today we've moved on to perhaps some integrative ideas. So by the time we finished with this session particularly, I'd like you to be able to contrast the different types of teaching evaluation that we do in our faculty and are available to you across the university, and then how you would integrate these evaluations into your teaching portfolio. Now, it's quite interesting to me that whenever somebody particularly wants to apply for promotion, they are told by, I don't know, various secretaries, and I see that I'm freezing, but just wave in the chat if you don't hear me too much. So they're told you need your teaching evaluations and write a list of your publications, and then you're good to go. You'll be available for promotion. And it doesn't really work that way. At the moment, HR is working on a new document that you have to fill in. It's their standard. What they're saying is the minimum information. But that document is not the same as your teaching portfolio that's going to follow you across your career from institution to institution and country to country. So that teaching portfolio is the one where you store everything, and then for promotion you select a few things out of that portfolio to share. One of them would be your teaching philosophy, and some of them would be evaluations that you've had. So just as a matter of interest, has anybody interacted with the new HR document? You can just give me a thumbs up from the response bar if you have. Scott, yeah, did you put your hand up just to say you had? Okay, Kath, is your hand up also just to say you had?
I have, Shira, and
yeah.
I just, yeah, it's a very thorough document. There's a lot it's asking for, and I think it's made the job of applying even more
yes.
strenuous and stressful.
It hasn't made it easier, has it?
Yeah, and I'm hoping that it's now been 4 weekends that I'm working on it, like every Saturday, Sunday, sitting down to, gather what I've done and place it in the right section and see that it's put in right. I'm really hoping by having such a complete, listing that the promotions and staffing criteria people, the committee, I think would look and respect that broadness, right? And that there would be more inclusion and weight for the teaching component, because there's quite a lot, which is really nice to see. There's quite a lot of teaching within that CV, along with service, along with research, and then a new section also around leadership and management, which is also nice to see. So I'm hoping there's more weight to those beyond that super focused research.
Yes, aren't we all hoping?
Thank you.
So I think that was the idea, and HR did consult quite widely within the faculty about what they think would be important or not. I still can't get over the fact that some parts of that CV do count more in real terms. So although you might have an unbelievably impressive teaching portfolio and be viewed as a distinguished teacher, you would still need another good mark in one of the other quadrants in order to get that promotion. And you would not have all of the criteria for research, for example. So if the slot you're going for requires 20 publications, if you have 19 publications and an amazing teaching portfolio, having won every award in the university, you probably would not get that promotion yet. And they'd say, you've got one more to go, just go away and do it. And in fact, most heads of schools would not entertain that kind of an application. I've heard heads of schools say, have 2 over. So wait until you've got 22 and then apply again. So they're not telling the people who don't have outstanding teaching portfolios, go away and do better teaching and then apply later. But they do want you to fulfill at least the baseline criteria for everything. So yes, I'm really excited that they are looking at more categories to look for people's strengths. And that's why I think it's important for you to work on your teaching portfolio to show specifically what you can do and how you think. And one of the biggest weaknesses that I find when I review these portfolios is that people give a statement, a teaching philosophy. This is what I believe about how people learn, and therefore this is why I teach like I teach. And then they incorporate a whole bunch of evaluations with no commentary at all. And often their concluding statement on the teaching portfolio is completely the antithesis of what their philosophy actually is. So, for example, I have people saying, oh, I'm a constructivist, and I believe that students build their own knowledge in their heads through experience and linking to prior experience. And I believe that students should be self-directed and go and do their own stuff. And then they say, I got this bad evaluation because I did it just before the final exam, and students were anxious about being able to answer all the questions that I gave. And so it's not actually my fault, it's their fault that the evaluation isn't so good. So you can see the dichotomy there about the self-reliant student-centeredness and then suddenly giving a large-scale exam full of facts and figures. And so you see what I'm saying in terms of, thanks Scott for sharing, ways of integrating your evaluations with the sentiment of your portfolio. Has anybody ever had a teaching evaluation that made them feel really lousy? Like, why do I do this? Why did I bother here? So I certainly have, particularly in doing innovative things. I really sound like back on the horse, but I was one of the first lecturers who tried this idea of a flipped classroom way back in 2012 when it had just started to come into the literature. There were maybe 3 or 4 papers on it, and I thought, oh, amazing idea. So rushed off and flipped a classroom with about 100 students in it. I had a 40-hour block with, so that's two-hour sessions twice a week, 10 weeks, and threw myself heart and soul into this, which took an enormous amount of preparation and an even bigger amount of marking. And at the end of the entire block, obviously, I did an evaluation to see how the students had coped and what they thought. And the evaluation came back with shocking numbers. They hated it. And worse than hating it, they felt like I'd abrogated my responsibility in not standing in front of them and teaching. And they were very vocal about it, which hurt, I have to admit. It doesn't make you feel good when something you think has really, really taken energy and effort and you think has provided an exceptional learning experience, and the students don't like it. So what's the moral of that story? Somebody jump in and tell me, what do you take away from that story? Come guys, most of you are teachers. Have you had a similar experience, or what do you think I should have learned from that story? Nabila, you can't please everyone. And also you learn from all feedback. So what should I have learned from that? Yeah, Kath, another point. Innovation does take time. But time from who and for who? Yeah. Okay, Catherine first and then Dr. Jacobson.
Students and all of us feel something is worthwhile and quality, not only because of our own journey, but because of our peers and the context that we're in. So if you're dealing with a context that is like X and you're trying something that's like Q, and there's a mismatch of, say, expectation and of discourse around it, then it will take a while for the two to align again, no matter how unbelievable the input from the teacher is. So if there's a suspicion or a hesitancy that this competency that I've gained doesn't align with what other people expect around me, then that mismatch will produce a lack of confidence, which can result in people saying, I learned from you, but I don't know if what I learned the right way or for the right purpose. And a single teacher alone can't achieve that, whether they're a high school teacher, electrifying people about physics or the English curriculum, but where other people, other teachers' chatter is, this won't produce a good matric result. Or other students in earlier years, or a person's sister or brother say, that's not what we did. And the same is true for a university. That's why I mean by it takes time. So innovation can be excellent, but it takes a village to recognize innovation. And students' sense of whether they've learned something well and whether what they've learned is useful takes place in a field, a complex field, which does not depend on the individual teacher.
That's very helpful. Yes. So all of that is true. And one needs to really examine 5 years down the line if what I did at that point had impact and what the lasting nature of that impact was and how they actually interpreted that learning. Mervyn?
Thanks. It's not doctor as you dropped. I'm very pleased. Thank you very much. Yeah, Nabila's comment and Catherine's comments are absolutely to the point. And the thought that went through my mind while you were relating your experience was twofold. It's great to be innovative and we've got good ideas and we want to share those ideas. But I started thinking about how I would feel if a teacher came to me and said, hey, I've got these fantastic new ideas and this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. And as a student, I'm straight away out of my comfort zone, and my first reaction is to be defensive and say, hey, this is a lot of rubbish. You're not doing it the way we want it done, or we don't understand what you actually want from us with this new technology, and we can't relate to you, and therefore, because we can't relate, it's not okay. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It absolutely does. And that's what happened, interestingly, when you are not forced into innovation. So this was an elective choice of mine. And yeah, to answer some of the statements in the chat, and you are quite right, I didn't actually spring it on them. We negotiated. I sat down with the class. I explained what the whole idea would be. And we actually negotiated learning outcomes for every single one of the sessions so that they would know the end point of where they were going to and what they had to know. And then I tried different ways of leading them towards those endpoints. So I think that the motivation was quite clear. It's just that, as we were saying, innovation produces absolute uncertainty and insecurity, and it wasn't what they'd done before. What had been done in those classes before, and that produced quite a lot of dissonance. So I'm not going to go onto the track where this conversation could take us, which is how do you introduce innovation? And for example, like with the COVID pandemic hitting us, the innovation was forced. It had to happen, and students had to accept it. And we then had to mediate how different ways we could help students bridge that sudden innovation in our pedagogies. But that's not the conversation I want to have. What I want you to focus on now is how do I play that event in my teaching portfolio? Because from my point of view, it was obvious what I'd done and why I'd done it. But from the student's point of view, here's this evaluation that said this was the most shocking thing I've ever sat through and I hated it. So what should I do with that? And I want to be promoted for my teaching excellence. Mervyn, go ahead.
I come from as you're aware, a long clinical background. And for me, the personal interaction of clinical teaching is as critical as the academic input. So it's not just enough to explain things and to use plastic models and to watch videos. I think the exchange between a pupil and a teacher at that level depends very much on literally a human interaction, the body language, the intonation, the physical exchange of how to do things or how to observe things is taken away from us by this almost, it is in fact a technological, unemotional background, and it deprives the teacher the opportunity to expose the various disciplines and the student to actually appreciate them in their full clinical context.
So context is key. You're absolutely right. And I do think it's also important to take the feedback, as they were saying earlier in the chat, and to learn from it. Here we are, Carol Dweckians, having this growth mindset and saying that all feedback can contribute to our learning and that we need to take it on board, no matter how hurt we are by that feedback and no matter how much we think they're wrong. We need to develop a space where we can take a step back and say, maybe from their perspective, they're not wrong. And how would I internalize what it was that we're actually doing? But that still kind of leads me to the question of, you guys are all being goody two-shoes. Okay, if I got such a shocking evaluation, why do I need to put it in my teaching portfolio? Can't I just lose that one and put it in the bottom drawer? And certainly that's not what I'm going to choose when I put forward for my promotion, is it?
If I may, it's in fact a challenge to better oneself rather than to put it away. One has to then rethink about how one presents it and how one exposes it. But again, from a clinical perspective, we've taken away the human context in terms of being with a patient, touching a patient, being in that environment. And that can't be replaced by technology in my brain.
So no, I agree with you. I mean, you definitely do want to learn from those encounters. And I'm not saying that the personal learning doesn't happen, but now we're talking about a teaching portfolio and putting it forward. So Nabila in the chat says, you have some constructive criticism and then you talk about how you improved from it. So that's great. And I'll take Stuart and then Yanis. And Kath, is that a hand up or is it a legacy hand?
It's a hand.
Okay, so Stuart, then Yanis, then Kath.
So I think it's important as part of your point on that you don't just throw everything into your teaching portfolio as like a big list of evaluations and stuff like that, but rather that it sort of tells a story, that there's a bit of a narrative there. So you can include it in a way that shows, you know, how you progressed over time, how you learned lessons. You don't want to just dismiss it out of hand, but rather show how then you did the course the next year and the next year, and how you've shown how part of staffing promotions is showing that how you have learned and progressed. So I think it's important that when you put together the teaching portfolio, that it isn't just a bucket of things you've thrown in there, but it seems to tell a story that points towards how you've evolved as a teacher. So it can be useful, but it needs to be carefully thought out and with some degree of explanation of what you took from it and then what you did next. Sherry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. You can use it as part of your narrative in showing your own progression. And that's why when people hand in teaching portfolios where it says on the staffing and promotions list that you have to have 3 evaluations, they put incredible pressure on the faculty development unit to produce those evaluations within 2 weeks and then submit them all. Here you are, I've got 3 evaluations. That's not the point at all. You want to see evaluations over time, showing a progression of what it is that you've done and your innovation and why you took a dip or why you didn't take a dip. So you need to be able to play that narrative off. Yanis, you're next.
Well, I just actually wanted to say exactly what Stuart said. It's about that narrative, and it's also about showing that you're taking risks in your curriculum development, which I think is very important. I mean, I just made a joke when I said don't be innovative, because I think it's very important to be innovative in the curriculum space, and it's about the lessons that you learn from that. And show how you're going to do it differently next year. Because I think that's you know, the important thing about the portfolio as well is showing how you are growing. So yeah.
That is exactly what they want to see. Kath, I'll take a comment from you, and then I'm going to share a screen of criteria that maybe we need to think about a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to raise something quite sticky and difficult. And it's not to take us away from these really positive and helpful points, which I applaud. But I think a lot of people, particularly younger colleagues who are recently completed some kind of qualification or a particular benchmark, and that's what's brought them into the lecturing space, experience a strange and complicated phenomenon from students, which has been well documented, and that is the sort of gaslighting and the projection that students have that they're not in capable hands, which is a very complicated dynamic. And in our country, that is accentuated if people are, for example, a Black woman, if a person who's a lecturer has got a physical or other kind of challenge. For example, they might be partially sighted, or they might be in a wheelchair. And it's exacerbated also if people have quote unquote different accents than the ones students expect. I've been part of 3 universities now where my colleagues have experienced extreme forms of this, which has, in a sense, the student evaluation has been the place where some, a minority, but a vocal minority of students have used the evaluation as a way to sort of work through their own space. And this has been very painful. And it has resulted in a very talented person I know at a university right here in Joburg leaving academia because of the way that the evaluation was used and not unpacked by colleagues sufficiently. And there weren't checks and balances on that. And I just wanted to table that because when I was first appointed as a lecturer, even though I was a white middle-class South African with an overseas degree and a so-called typical white South African accent, I got a lot of pushback around sexist and other comments. They stopped when I got older, and maybe also I learned other techniques. But I've never forgotten that. I never told anyone at the time. But I've seen how this is happening still in South Africa, and I just think it's a very complicated space, and it needs to sort of be mentioned. So I'm sorry to bring it up. I know we can't unpack it here, but it is something that a lot of people wrestle with, I know.
So actually all staff developmental areas, and I see Anastasia agrees with you completely, are complicated spaces, because what are the expectations of what a facilitator is versus what a lecturer is versus what the university owes you because you paid fees versus what the students should be able to do because they're adult learners. So here we're throwing in a whole lot of ideas of people's expectations, and soliciting student evaluations puts you right in the middle of that space. And it depends what the level of the students are or is. How does that work? Are. Because, for example, first years, you get lots of comments about the clothes that you wear. You know, he always wears the same jacket, I see, or his sneakers don't match, or you know, this kind of stuff, which is really not what we're interested in and what we want to be seeing. And yes, there can be some very, very personal comments. But at the same time, there can be some really useful comments about stuff that you didn't know about that you were either doing or not doing. And so it's something that we need to think about, because the truth is there is a huge literature on bias in student evaluations. And it's something that I'm actually passionate about suppressing the use of, because there is, interestingly, across countries and across institutions, the bias is towards males and young males and authoritative males. So it doesn't matter who you are. If you fall into that category, you'll get better evaluations no matter what you're doing. And even when you can prove that such a thing is wrong. For example, there was a large-scale study that involved the evaluation of how fast student feedback came and assignments were marked. And the males scored better than the females, even though it was shown clearly that the females responded faster and with better feedback, longer feedback. So evaluation's huge pinch of salt. But also the idea that an evaluation isn't actually talking about lecturer competence. It's about talking about student preference. So even the people that come out of these evaluations with 8.5s and 9s, you know, the fantastic numbers, and yes, I have a whole discussion about whether numbers mean anything in this context either, but even those people, we do have to really think carefully about what the evaluations are telling us. And I usually say cover the numbers and look at what the student comments are, because that's where you are personally going to grow from that feedback. So there are two elements that we're looking at here within evaluation. What can you grow from? What's the feedback? What can you learn? How can you improve on the one hand? And on the other hand, how do you present yourself for promotion, particularly if you're keen on being known for your teaching? And you want to show that this is where your particular interest is. So the two seem to be, there seems to be a tension between the two. They seem to be almost in conflict. And to come back and answer the question that I posed earlier, would you just put it in a bottom drawer? I have been in the privileged position of seeing a lot of the evaluations. Our faculty was the only one where evaluations came through CHSE for faculty development before they went back to the person who had requested the student evaluation. So I've been in a position to see a lot of evaluations as they come through. They've changed the system now, by the way. I don't get to see them anymore. It was considered inappropriate. How do you like that? So you can choose if you need faculty development now, depending on the basis of your evaluation. But a lot of people said, oh, I don't like this, or the number's not high enough, I'm not including this one. And the challenge has to be, how do you do exactly what Stuart said, which is take the bad number and integrate it into the story of how you've improved or what you've changed to address what it was that the students were concerned about. And also, perhaps, part of the narrative is why the student's concern is not appropriate for your teaching. The students are not always right. Just because they don't enjoy something doesn't mean that it's not a good learning exercise. And I think that's a disconnect that people often don't see when they're presenting themselves as what they think is in the best light. Whereas somebody who comes in with 3 evaluations that all say they're a top-notch person doesn't give the committee any space to see how that person has developed into who they are. Staffing promotions is a lot about what's the movement. So you come in at a certain level and they want to see how you've improved what it is you do as you go up through the ranks. And so showing that you're just at the top of your game always sometimes shoots you in the foot. Because how do you justify always being at the top of your game when you're trying to show that you're improving? So if you come in right at the top, it's hard to show that improvement. Right, I want to now just have a look at some of the criteria that the university thinks about when they want to adjudicate good teaching. And here we have criteria for some of the teaching awards. So they'll talk about the overall performance in teaching, and here they mean a composite of student feedback, and as I've said before, not only in our university but across universities, there's now a little bit of cynicism with regard to student feedback as being representative of good teaching. It might be representative of popularity, and it might be representative of technical things that you could improve in your teaching, but perhaps not so representative of good teaching. You also then need peer feedback. And peer feedback is a whole nother category, because it's not your buddy in the department that you're going to just ask to write you a peer review. We need to think about how it is, particularly in our faculty where we have such a range of teaching. So from the bedside, chairside teaching, to the small groups, to tutorials, to the very large groups which we're now doing on an electronic platform. So all of those things contribute towards how you deliver and therefore what peers would say of your actual teaching. And then the narrative that binds the two is the self-adjudication. And that's where the story comes in, where you need to show clearly, not just this is student feedback, this is peer feedback, and this is my feedback of what's going on, but you actually need to weave your story through the student feedback and the peer feedback to show clearly how you've developed within your teaching capacity and why you changed things and what that meant to you personally. And remember, the whole thing is here integration. So it needs to be congruent with the philosophy of teaching that you stated up front. So if you say, I developed a whole new testing system where at the end of every week I tested to see if students knew the relevant anatomy and to make sure that they were keeping up to date with their coursework. But in your philosophy, you've said, I actually believe in learning through communities of practice, and people just through being in the wards will learn the skills that they need and will become masters through that method. You can see that giving weekly tests for factual content isn't congruent with the philosophy that you've stated. And so it might seem like a good thing to include because it's something you've done in your teaching, but you need to overall show how your philosophy feeds into the decisions you make in your teaching and how the response you got from those evaluations feed back into more decisions that you make about your teaching. So I've left this up on the screen for a while and I hope you've had a chance to read it. But you can see what they prioritize in terms of looking for improvement in your teaching and a positive trajectory of teaching. So innovation, yes, is right up there, not only in the learning opportunities you design for students, but in assessment. It's a huge area of development. So looking at your ability to design a good learning experience, which is curriculum development, your actual prosecution of that. So in other words, how you presented it pedagogically, and then what assessment strategies could you come up with that are aligned with the way that you taught and the thing that you taught. Then they want us to be contextually relevant. So how relevant is it to a South African context? And then, of course, they have to add in, because where there's big research-intensive university, without sacrificing relevance or standards. They mean global relevance and standards of, for example, external boards like the HPCSA or the Accounting Board or the Board of Electronic Engineers and that gang. And then, how are you helping students to develop their own learning? So can you show that you've made realistic intellectual demands of students? And then how do you then show how you support students in achieving those demands that you've made? And lastly, you'll see from what Scott's posted in the chat in terms of the criteria document, they're looking to see if you are slowly being inculcated into the practice of being a scholar. So they mean a scholar with regard to your teaching and learning. So not just your research area and your niche and your papers that you're producing for your research, but also that you can look at your teaching in a scholarly way, that you can share with others your methods and your results, and you can put that into a context which other people will understand in terms of their own learning trajectory and in terms of the learning theories that are out there. Then they want to know how you are concerned with diversity. So how would you accommodate, for example, students with poor sight in your classroom? Would it be possible for somebody who's blind, for example, to learn your discipline? Or students who have different preparedness for different skills that you're talking about. And so they want to know that you've thought about that. And then perhaps the impact here that you're talking about in terms of how what you've done has impacted your colleagues or other people in the department, or people around you. So, for example, in the online learning space, we had people who became really good at putting things up on the learning management system, and a lot of people would go to them for personal help because they had mastered it and they were sharing with others. So a whole lot of ways of evaluating what it is that you're producing, not just I gave a lecture and the students gave me 8 out of 10. So these are ideas that you can weave through your narrative on why it is that you got the evaluation that you got and how you think you can work on improving the ways that you present your teaching and the ways that you have evaluated yourself and therefore share with the committee. So I want to know, in the chat you can drop me a line, or you can do some hands up too, how you feel with regard to those criteria. Do you think you could weave them into how you write your portfolio? Do you think we should advertise them widely? Do you think that lends itself to corruption, in that people then see the high points of what's advisable, and then people will just start saying things that aren't happening? How do you think that those sorts of criteria should be managed when people are trying to showcase their teaching or putting themselves forward in teaching? So it's very demanding, isn't it? Yep. Yeah, Kath, it hasn't fallen off the edge of the universe. The chat is still here. I think that it becomes scary. As Scott says, if you work 4 weekends in a row trying to write things down, it becomes extremely onerous. And that's why it's such a good idea at these kind of faculty development events to say, always keep faculty development in the back of your head. And every single week, you can write down what you taught, what you thought about your teaching, how your teaching corresponds to a certain level of criteria that you can decide for yourself, or you could take the university criteria and try and rank yourself and try and capture your comments on a weekly basis. Because if you do that, then when you go back in your learning journal, you can then extract areas where you can see the progression from between something that you've done for the first time and then something that you've done for the 10th time with the class, and what those kinds of comments can produce. And it will also give you a better idea of when you can ask for an evaluation, because sometimes it's not always the case that the evaluation comes at a good time for students to be able to give feedback on you. And also in our faculty, we have a huge disadvantage in that people don't tend to teach big blocks of things, except in maybe the very basic sciences right at the beginning. So you have one lecture from a registrar here, and in another unit, in another rotation, you'll have another lecture over there. And it's not actually as concentrated. So you don't develop the persona as a teacher that allows the students to make a more holistic evaluation. If they see you once and you need an evaluation for promotion, then you're going to ask for that evaluation and they're going to give you a once-off kind of opinion. And that's either great, it really worked well, or not so great and it didn't work at all. So you can see what I think the pressures are in building a portfolio that is meaningful and also that is useful to yourself. Because as I said, there are those two areas where you would want to extend what it is that you know, but that you also need to be able to present yourself as you go. Stuart, do you want to come in here?
I think one of the really intimidating things is you see how extensive that the form is that's got posted, where you trying to balance, where you're trying to tick, if you try to tick every box, you're going to land up doing none of the things well. Yeah,
so it's not realistic actually to tick every box.
So it's easy to sort of become despondent, or you get so busy teaching and with meetings and stuff like that, you suddenly start to remember you've fallen behind in your teaching portfolio. Or maybe something that you spend huge amounts of time on lands up being one line in the teaching portfolio, even if it uses up so much of your time. So I think that gets important not to feel like you need to tick every single box.
Yeah.
Because you start to feel like there's not enough hours in the day to meet all the requirements.
So Stuart, I think that's good advice. And I think Yanis can come in here also to give us some, or some of the interns, some technical tips. Because, for example, you don't have to write down every single week. You can capture a voice note. It's harder to flick through voice notes, though. So bear in mind, maybe you want to use something like Otter, where your voice note is then transcribed. And that's good practice for transcription and indexing and being able to pick up keywords. So those are the kinds of events I think that you can practice on, because that's a low stakes thing, capturing your own teaching portfolio, but learning a different technical skill while you do it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about best practice here. And the last thing I want to share with you is here. Where is it? One. Okay, maybe I'll go here and see if I can go one back. No, I want to move this whole thing. That's not going to help me. There we go. Okay. University of Stellenbosch, love what they're doing. And I saw Yanis for some of your ex-colleagues a lot over the weekend. They were very well represented at AMI. Here is a teaching portfolio example of the University of Stellenbosch website. And she's given permission for her details to be used. And she has captured her teaching portfolio on WordPress as a kind of blog repository website. And it starts with a homepage, which is really who she is, and then a discussion about what's going to happen. So there's a section about who she is and about her teaching and about context, and then about future plans. Yes, sure. I will send you a link. And then if you go through each thing that she speaks about, she tells you she's a chartered accountant. And if you want to look at a brief resume, she's got here her research and publications, her postgraduate supervision, her contribution to teaching, and then her own continual professional development. And that's about her about. And you can choose to go to any of them. If we look at her contribution to teaching, then that's also quite a complicated section, because she has teaching. She has her teaching philosophy as a separate thing, and then she integrates that with her context. So the accounting students that she teaches and what the needs are of those students that she's identified through her work. Then she speaks specifically about her teaching practice, and that then in that space is where she integrates her evaluations. And then she talks about how maybe she could improve her teaching and her research on the basis of what she's got. It's a very elegant portfolio, because this is how we spoke about how you could put in a table of what you've taught. So she's electronically captured all the things that she's taught along the way. This is, by the way, a good tip. Always start with the least date where you started, the lowest date first, so that by the time you get to the beginning of the table, you've got the most recent stuff. In two ways that helps. First of all, you know that you're always just going to put in lines at the top of the table. And secondly, people are seeing your freshest stuff first. And then they can go back and see all the other stuff that you've done. So in this instance, she talks about the things that she's done to improve her continuous professional development, and also her professional development with regard to her subject. So her studies, short courses she's done, teaching short courses and workshops, etc. So a really good section on where she's going. And let's have a look at, okay, you want to have a look at her philosophy? remember I said you can't copy philosophies because it's just that you need to be able to make it your own. So I particularly chose her because she's very Stellenbosch. She's chosen Paulo Freire as her model to look at the banking idea, and that's what she doesn't want to be. She doesn't want her students to be able to regurgitate answers. She wants them to be critical thinkers and develop understanding and come to grips with the complexity of the field. So I really liked that. Something like accountancy, which sounds so dry and numberish to me, she's chosen a philosophy of teaching which really resonates, I think, with a lot of us in terms of social responsibility and also how students learn, how she needs to teach so that students can learn. And then she goes straight from the philosophy into context. What the issues are with lecturing sustainably to accounting students, and what sustainable development is, and the kinds of things that she wants them to learn and how she wants them to learn it. So she shows the slide at various points through the lecture to show them where the progression should lead to. I want to get to the page where she actually shows you what the students are saying about her. So here she's overt. She says, my teaching practice, as grounded in my teaching philosophy, is characterized by experimentation and a quest and a focus, etc., etc. And she uses words like ontological and epistemological, which is not nearly necessary in a teaching portfolio, but certainly shows that she's thought about things, which is really lovely. And here she's showing you how it fits in with her dialogic approach and why she chose to do certain things. And here she's taken areas of concern with the teaching, what the theme is. So, for example, teaching and delivery or curriculum design or innovation in assessment. And then she's given a hyperlink example to where she specifically discusses these things. So that's a very strong link with showing what her problem was that she picked up either from her teaching or from the evaluations, and then how it is that she dealt with that problem, or where her reflection took her in terms of working towards a resolution. So you can get back to teaching practice if you want. These were all of her solutions to her problems. I specifically looked at this one, how not to drown your students, and she's giving a whole lot of things that she's tried. Group presentations, wikis, glossaries, forums. I'm looking for a page where she actually did word clouds of how it was that students responded to her. And I can't see it now, but if I post the link in the chat, you will see what it is that she's done. So who's inspired people? Who wants to be like her? Scott, how long do you think it would take to make a teaching portfolio like that you can cut and paste out of?
Yeah, well, as you're going through that, I thought, okay, well, I've done half the work because I'm now put it in all these sections the CV template helps me to do, and now I can move it into areas of a website, and I can be more creative. I mean, I think this project I'm doing now is very much listing. It's a lot of listing and details of getting the the wording right on each of the entries and getting the dates right and et cetera. And so I think the website actually is a bit of fun. As educators, we tend to be a bit creative, and so that would be a nice project to bring the CV, all the words, into that cool display. Thank you.
Yeah, so I put the link in the chat, but I mean, there are many examples, but I just love the contextual example of somebody in a parallel field, but who we could resonate with, who's close to home. Yanis, join the chat.
Yeah, so We for the interns, I've actually started a portfolio project, not really just about a teaching portfolio, but a portfolio showcasing, you know, what they've done during the internship and so forth, to align them with, you know, getting jobs after the internship. And we've used Portfolio for that, which I've mentioned before, works really well. And the one thing I just found, and that's also with my own portfolio, is that you kind of need to schedule an hour a week to sit and do it.
It's important to keep it up.
Yeah, and also sort of creating a community where you hold each other accountable. So I think, and I don't know, Ashad, if I saw you on the call, if you agree, but the fact that I'm putting deadlines for us as a team to work on portfolios means that we need to you know, stay up to date and comment on each other's. So on Friday, we gave each other comments and asked questions about artifacts that you added to your portfolio and what could you know, add additionally and so forth. And yeah, I think that works really well. So if you set up with your teams sessions to do something like that.
But the bottom line is it actually takes active work.
Yes.
Whether you leave it until you want to be promoted and then you have to scrabble back over years of stuff, or whether you do it on a weekly basis and you keep yourself up to date, and then you try and be innovative and you find different and fun ways of doing it, it's still going to take active work. Yeah. Anastasia?
So just one.
Yeah, okay, finish off, yeah.
So just on what you said about active work as well, the one thing I find very easy, because it's like I only schedule time here and there to do it, is I created a Word folder on Office 365 called Jana's Portfolio. And every time I'm busy creating a new assessment or do something, and I know that at some point I want to add it there, I'll just save it there as well. So I'll save it in the additional folders, but I just save it in that folder, which makes it a bit easier.
Sure, that's a good idea. Anastasia?
Thank you very much, Shira. I enjoyed looking at, is that Ariana, the teaching portfolio, and you know, I love the way she put things together. But as you shared that, and just before Janus started speaking, last year I had the privilege of attending a course organized by, I think it was CLTD, I'm not too sure which body. It was called the Facilitating Online Course.
Oh yes, CLTD,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a marvelous 8-week course, and we were, one of the things, Janus was a facilitator for that session, where we were taught on how to put together a portfolio, and at the end of the session or at the end of the course, we were meant to submit the portfolio and then, you know, have a panel just talk through, and it was quite interesting, and so that has formed for me a foundation in terms of putting together a portfolio, and has become a skill, a soft skill that, you know, I'm still working on for myself and also for the course. But I think it's interesting and exciting to see people who have moved very much further with putting together a portfolio like the one you've just shared. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. I do think it's important to help us with our own metacognition and self-reflection. That if we can look at what we're doing with a degree of distance and acknowledge whether it worked or it didn't work, and how it is that we think we could improve it, and say upfront whether it was a session that achieved its aims and goals or not. So always to go back to that objective slide and say, okay, now that we're at the end of this session, do we understand what the different kinds of reviews are and how we would integrate them with our own philosophy? And also whether it's theoretical or whether it's practical. And from Janus's suggestion, the theoretical always has to lead to the practical. So while you've got 10 minutes of how to do it in a theoretical sense, let's allocate a half an hour of practical so that people actually come out of the session with something in their hand. And I'm hoping that right now, all of you are going to go and spend 30 minutes on your teaching portfolio, thinking about how to write a narrative around your evaluations that show your thinking processes in how you integrate the kinds of innovation that you've put into your teaching, and also how you've moved from year to year or from class to class through different iterations of your current teaching. So thanks for sticking it out, everybody. I hope that if you do need assistance, you know that CHSE is always available to give people advice on developing their teaching portfolios. And also, it is important to not only ask questions, but to share with your peers. It's really hard to put yourself out there, but sometimes it helps you to see what other people have done. And it gives you good ideas about how you can write up what you've done. So it's a conversation we should be having openly, not behind closed doors in committees where people don't share documents. My take for the afternoon. Have a good one, everybody. Cheers. Yanis, do you want to talk about what's happening next week? I'm kind of not on the plot with where we are.
Sure. So next week is Lizelle, right? Stuart. Sorry, I'm also now. So there's 3 sessions. We start
next week's me.
You next week.
Yeah.
Okay. So
next week's the 7th, right?
Yes. So yeah, Stuart will be presenting a journal article next week, and then after that would be the learning workshop and for OSCEs, and after that the technology for OSCEs.
Brilliant. Okay, looking forward. OSCEs it is. Should be good. I hope you're going to record next week's session. I'm recording an apology right now. Stuart, I'm sorry, it's Rosh Hashanah. I'm not going to be there to listen, but I will come back and have a look at the recording. Very interested in what you have to say. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.